thanks. For anybody who's worried, the slides will go up on the website later because I will be in a hotel with a decent Wi-Fi connection tonight. Having had to stay up till 1:30 in the morning to download files for you guys to all get off the same broadband, right? I also think Chris Matt's asking for the books to be signed as a unemployed to get an endorsement, all right? And he's run off to London before I can retaliate for the 1876 remark. But he is on a training course I'm running next week. So if anybody wants to be a last-minute booking, Chris is coming and I am training him, all right? So that will be an entertainment in its own right. Okay, I want to start off with this slide from Hugh. If anybody doesn't know the Gaping Void cartoons, I strongly recommend them. You can actually subscribe and get one of these every day along with Dilbert. You know, if I didn't have both of those coming in, I think I'd go insane. This, for me, summarizes what's been my role over the years. The other word for it is curmudgeon, which is a phrase I'm particularly proud of. I'm also proud of cynic, because cynics are the people who care. Anybody who's cynical is not being negative. They actually care about the organization and they care about what you're doing. People eliminate this stuff too fast. So what I want to do is to start off with some general remarks about the whole Agile Lean community at the moment. That will get at least 50% of the audience irritated, 50% interested. Then I want to move into some broad principles. How many people know about complex adaptive systems theory? Put your hands up. Okay, very few, so I'm going to have to do the 101 stuff on that. And then I want to go through two sets of methods or tools which have been referenced by several other speakers. One is the whole concept of safe to fail experimentation, which I now start to define as a pre-Scrum process. And I'll go through a framework to explain that. Scrum starts too late in the innovation cycle. It requires too much acceptance and too much belief and too much resource to really do true exploration. So I want to talk about different techniques for that early stage cycle. And then I'm going to talk about our work on micro-narrative, particularly the work we're doing on co-evolutionary approaches to user requirements capture and monitoring. Part of my goal here, having been one and knowing the evil that they perpetrate, is to eliminate systems analysis from the entire process. Because all they do is gather people's stories up and write them in documents, which are what they wanted to do in the first place. And if you don't know it, the evidence from cognitive science is if you conduct more than 2 interviews, your brain forms a subconscious hypothesis, and thereafter you only hear what conforms with that hypothesis. No? And anybody who says their training prevents it probably formed a hypothesis before the first interview. Yeah, so they should be even less trustworthy. So, some basic statements up front. Firstly, I think one of the problems we got with Agile, and particularly the Snowden manifesto, is it swung the pendulum. If you actually read it, it doesn't say we're for this, it actually says we're against these things. And that's not unusual when you get a new movement, right? So basically we react against the things which are bad in the past. The trouble is we overreact. So for example, the overemphasis on doing what the users want and not actually giving things that the users didn't know they needed. Yeah, it's kind of like a classic pendulum type swift. And for anybody who knows their philosophy, this is actually Hegelian antithesis. You get a dominant approach, you get the rebellion against it. It's only once you've got the rebellion out of the way you can move on to something new. And I think that's where we are at the moment. And there's a series of movements going on, kind of like post-agile type stuff at the moment. There's a meeting in Oregon shortly, which I'm at and others, to try and actually say, okay, now we've learned what we shouldn't do and we've made some progress, where do we go next? Because we need something more substantial. Yeah? So that's kind of like number one. The second thing, and I keep saying this and everybody agrees with it and they carry on doing it, a linear process done faster is still a linear process. Most scrums are still linear processes. It's we'll do it and we'll keep doing it till we get it right and we'll have few iterations and the velocity will increase. But it's still a linear process. It's not a non-linear process. And that seems to be an inability to break away from the assumptions of the past, the basic beliefs about how you do things. If you really understand lean, then it's about eliminating the waste, that what I fondly call Six Sigma. Anybody come across Six Sigma yet? Yeah. Business process re-engineering with the worst aspects of American Bible Belt fundamentalism added onto it for good measure. It's a cult. The high priests of the cult get different coloured belts to indicate their status in the cult. And if they get a black belt, they're exempt from doing any real work because now they're a parasite who imposes the rules on the people who do. If you actually read any of the original Lean literature properly, you know it's about eliminating the waste that approaches based on efficiency create. Yeah? And this is a big problem because you can see this extensively within the software development community. And that leads me to what I think is the most important point here, is that we need to think of software as a service and not as a manufacturing process, particularly in its early stages of development. There's a point where software becomes a manufacturing process, but it's not until quite advanced in a life cycle. In the early stage life cycle, it's a co-evolutionary interaction between users and technology capability. And therefore, kind of like fundamental rule, you don't start with manufacturing models and metaphors. The trouble is, virtually every agile method comes from a manufacturing background, moves sideways, and is making the same mistakes that companies like IBM made when they tried to move from manufacturing to services, or the pharmaceutical industry are making when they're trying to move from manufacturing to services. People from a manufacturing background find services cultures very difficult to understand because they're uncomfortable with the uncertainty. And if you look at all the Kanban boards and the post-it notes and the structured processes, it's all about actually eliminating uncertainty rather than living with it. It tries to make uncertainty into small digestible chunks, so we don't have to panic about it too much. So that switch to a service model requires a more fundamental rethink than we're seeing in the community at the moment. Also, process is key. One of the problems if you focus on a manufacturing approach is you have these very structured approaches, and then there's all these things which don't fit. And that's when we get into the magical mystery stuff. Yeah, it's all about good people doing good things, and it's open space, and it's self-organization, by which you use code word for anarchy. Most people in Agile don't understand self-organization. They think it either means letting people do what the hell they want without any constraint, which is actually a bad idea. Yeah, or they think it means letting me do whatever I want without constraint, but I'll control the other bastards. All right, there are variations on the theme, but that's kind of like the way it works. Human beings fundamentally you can't change a system by changing the people. Major disagreement between people like me and people like Peter Senge. And actually that approach hasn't worked. You can't change enough people for the system to change over time. If you change the system, people change faster. And this is a very old debate. It's one of the fundamental differences. It's one of the commonalities between systems thinking and complexity thinking, which are otherwise different, is that they focus on systematic change so that people fall into processes so you get the behavior you want. Yeah? And that's a difficult thing because you can see a very strong focus on individual behavior. You see this negativity, so these are all the things that people do badly. Yeah, cognitive bias, for example. Remember I talked about this briefly yesterday. And therefore we'll stop doing it. Well, you can't. Yeah? Cognitive bias is a necessary part of human intelligence. The only people who aren't cognitively biased are autistic, because they make rational decisions based on a careful assessment of all available data, so they can't cope with the volume. One of the reasons we're cognitively biased is so we can handle things. The autonomic side of the brain uses little energy, copes with a huge amount of data. We wouldn't survive without it. So if you want to eliminate cognitive bias, you have to create processes with multiple human sensors in order to eliminate the bias by looking at the system as a whole, rather than to try and change individuals to stop them doing things which 150,000 years of evolution has patterned them to do. Yeah, and that's actually important, because the other problem we got is this assumption of a silicon is the same thing as carbon. For the last 20 or 30 years, one of the most fundamental errors in psychology, well, there have been two basic ones. One is behavioralism, and the other is the information processing model of the human mind. The human mind does not process information in the way that a computer does. Anybody come across the idea of the singularity? Okay, well, anybody who believes in that, their brain probably could be transferred to a computer. I mean, fundamentally, chemicals, gases, all sorts of things are fundamental to human intelligence. We're not just silicon-based binary switches. Yeah? So we need to start to understand that and start to work with it. It's a very different field. Yeah? And that's kind of like a play on this, because one of the things that you see extensively in the Agile, it's very prone to pop science, pseudoscience, and cults. I mean, anybody, for example, who takes neuro-linguistic programming seriously these days hasn't read the literature. Totally discredited in any scientific literature for over 15 years, but you still see it cropping up in Agile communities. Yeah, there's some bits and pieces in it that work, but coherently it's not there. And people, they basically read a popular book. They find a book, they read it, they create a method, they create a training course. They don't check the references, they don't go behind it. Cognitive science is going through massive change every 2 to 3 years at the moment. The idea that anybody has got it worked out is fundamentally foolish. We've got an idea of the direction, we know some things which don't work, but we're going in a different place. And this desire to have these simplistic solutions, these cult-like approaches, I think another speaker made reference to this yesterday, in fact Jim made it at the start yesterday. One of the problems, and remember Jim went through this idea of this cyclical change. One of the reasons we keep going through that is we're using an empirical model of science which is appropriate to Newtonian physics, but isn't appropriate to a modern age. It's the assumption you observe behavior and derive theory from it. Well, the trouble is that's inadequate because you can never observe enough behavior to derive theory, and also people change based on the theory you use. So you've got constant interaction between theory and practice. So that leads us into a new concept called praxis. Well, it's not a new concept, it's an old one, in which you allow theory to co-evolve with practice. And this is actually a medical model of research. Remember somebody showed an excerpt from House yesterday? Same principle again. All right, what you know an awful lot about biology and neuroscience, you've got patients, you try the theory, you experiment with the theory, you don't know what's going to work. As the two interact, both inform each other. No? And that's kind of like the model that I and others have been developing for some years. Okay, so let's move on now. I want to talk about the nature of things and our perception of things. Now, Chris said yesterday that I first published his work in 1876, so I'm glad to see he's finally acknowledging this. I first published this in 1982 and made the mistake of presenting it at the Pentagon to senior management team some years later, so I haven't been able to use it for a bit, but I'm now rehabilitating it. If we look at nature and perception, so if the nature of the world is known, or knowable, we kind of like know what's going on, and we know ourselves exactly what's happening, we're dealing with core process. That's a very simple world. Everything's fine. On the other hand, if the world is known, but we don't know what it is, that's where we're in the space of analysis. Yet we can find out what's going on, there is objective truth, we can deal with it. However, it then gets more interesting, because basically we then move on to the things we don't know, but which are knowable. Yeah? So we either have human sensors, bringing those into play, or in strategy we work into scenario planning. So we're dealing with the unknown, but it is knowable, therefore we start to scope or bound the respect of what you do. I haven't changed this for Agile, I've kept this as a generic management one, but you could make it Agile specific. That's partly because I was up till 1:30 this morning downloading files, so I just decided to use it anyway. But then we get to the really interesting stuff, the unknowable. This is stuff which is unknowable by its nature until you come across it. And that's actually where human sensor networks become key. Anybody come across the wisdom of crowds literature? Okay, well, the basic idea is if you have a large number of human beings independently making statistical judgments without knowledge of what the other people have done, you have huge validity in the data. My favorite example is an American submarine grounded off the coast of Portugal. It didn't sink. I was corrected on that by an admiral in Norfolk Navy Base. He pointed out submarines are meant to sink. I learned from that, always let yourself get humiliated by anybody with 3 stars on their shoulder in the first 5 minutes, because then it's out of their system and they'll listen to you thereafter. So either way, if they go down, they can't come up again, it's called grounding. So they got groups of experts around the world who didn't know who the other experts were to estimate its position. None of them got it right, but the average of all of the experts was 6 meters away from the submarine. We're now building sensor networks with whole of workforce engagement or whole of population engagement in 2 countries, which would allow us to use that human sensor network to create objective truth under faces of extreme uncertainty in real time. And that's where we're also moving with user requirement capture and user feedback. You're dealing with a system which can't be known in advance, so you need human sensor networks with real-time feedback in the immediate present in order to deal with it. Now, we're doing pioneering work at the moment in the medical system on actually predicting when patients should be looked at more closely because there's a danger of early or premature discharge from hospital, which has financial consequences. Now, there isn't a predictive model you can build for that, but you can trigger humans into a heightened state of alert to look at the problem more deeply. And that's one of the other big switches we see, the move from prediction to anticipatory alerts. Recognizing that human beings can send things that computers can't. You need the two working together. Computers have the capability of triggering humans to a heightened state of alert when they need to look at something more closely. We're about to start some work on that, on software error bugging and those sort of things. It's exactly the same problem as where we started all of this, which is weak signal detection in counter-terrorism, both before and after 9/11. It's the same problem. Yeah? There's really no difference between a terrorist, a consumer, and a user, or in terms of IT processes, if you think about it. And then, of course, we get the unimagined. Now, this is a very important concept. It's things that we're not capable of thinking of because they don't fit the pattern of our current experience. And that's where a huge amount of software programs go wrong. And that's where these large sensor networks of continuous micronarrative I'll talk about later come into their own. And of course, finally, the unimaginable unknowable. This is the area of major strategic shock. And again, that's where you have a whole body of work based on resilience. Taleb calls this anti-fragile. I've got to write a blog on this shortly because I actually think he means resilience. I know he says he doesn't. I actually think what he's trying to do is create a word which can be his own for branding purposes, rather than respect the fact he's done some interesting work which develops an existing body of literature. Now with that, and I'm not going to go into this detail, this is something we spent half a day on the course, you have this difference between forecasting, which is actually predicting the future, backcasting, which you're all familiar with, which you look backwards from a desired future state, and the work we're starting to do now, which is called sidecasting, you cast around for possibilities or plausibilities you wouldn't have thought of. Yeah? So that switch from forecasting, backcasting, sidecasting is key. And my argument is that actually most of Scrum sits within the backcasting environment. It defines where it wants to be and it gets there. It doesn't do the sidecasting, the exploring the potential, and that's the sort of co-evolutionary type approach. And for that we need new tools and methods. So the phrase here is practice makes perfect, and a metaphor I've used a lot, people referenced yesterday, is this doesn't work with recipe books. Yeah, and the trouble is that's what everybody in Agile produces. You know, here's something I did with 3 clients, therefore it must work for all other clients, with all other people under all circumstances, if you only come on my training courses. Or in the worst case, these are some things I've heard that other people did and I put them into my book and I've got a training course around it and I think it might work. Yeah, you all know the variations on this, all right? Recipe books are okay under conditions of stability and uncertainty where you have all the right ingredients. Where you don't, and this guy has got 2 Michelin 2 stars in Welsh restaurants, brilliant guy. Fundamentally, he served an apprenticeship, so he's got the scars. Interesting, if you didn't know it, how many people know how to use a slide rule? Okay, well, if it's any comfort, you're better at spotting software errors than the calculator generation. Because a slide rule, you have to have an estimate of whether the number is right or wrong. And therefore, your brain, at a key point of it, when it's very plastic, develops an ability to spot rightness or wrongness in numbers. Yeah, because that's what the slide rule requires you to do. The calculator generation can be out by 10 to the 6 and not realize it, because they haven't developed a key cognitive aspect, because we've given them too many tools too early, which remove that capability. Incidentally, if you can do an abacus, you're even better at it, no? On that process. But basically, if you've been there and done it, you've got an intuitive feel. The best estimates I've ever done, the one which started my company, was a $1.3 million contract with the Singapore government, which I estimated in half an hour, and we came in under budget. Because I've got 20, 30 years of software development experience, I know the maximum size of a man, a team who can do stuff. I'm quite good at phrasing things, so I've got latitude to interpret things with clients later. You get that after 20 years of experience. You know, you get to develop that in a high way, and fundamentally, I'm estimating at the right level of granularity. I'm not doing an aggregative bottom-up build, because actually you can't estimate big systems that way. You've got to see the system as a whole. You've got to have the right level of granularity in the way you work. But that only comes with experience and theory. My thesis is decision support systems. Yeah, I've actually got academic background and software background. You need the two together. Yeah? And incidentally, putting the recipe online doesn't make any difference. It's still a recipe. Okay, so 3 key concepts I want to use in this presentation. Apologies to those of you who've seen this before, but they're key. One is the concept of acceptation. That is a picture from the floods in Bangkok a few years ago. I did some work on the post-flood recovery. And a guy, you know the floods are coming several days in advance, all right? They're coming, all right? The headwaters are built up. And this guy didn't want his car destroyed. And luckily, he'd had a large item of furniture delivered in a big plastic bag. So he had a bright idea. He drove the car into the plastic bag and sealed the end. Now, every garage in Bangkok has got a specially designed plastic bag for people to put their cars in during the flood. It's a pity the Americans didn't learn about this before the last hurricane in New York, but never mind. Now, that's an example of what in biology is called acceptation. Something designed for one purpose is used for a completely different purpose where it has more utility. Anybody who uses Apple knows that Apple are masters of acceptation, not innovation. Yeah, Apple's genius is to find something developed for one other purpose and use it for something completely different. Yeah, when somebody notices a chocolate bar melts in their pocket in 1943 when they're maintaining a radar machine, that gives us the microwave oven. Brian Arthur has pointed out that nearly all major technology inventions have been acceptive, not adaptive. And actually, the key for that is the right level of granularity, something several speakers have mentioned. If you don't get the granularity right, which is why object orientation is so wonderful and not used properly, if you get your objects right, they can actually accept very quickly with other objects, whereas if they're too finely grained, they don't work. If they're too coarse, they don't work. This concept of granularity, modularity, has a very solid biological background, not just a design background. And incidentally, one of the things I remember arguing this on corporate committees in the UK years ago, we need to think about people as objects as well as software. One of the fundamental mistakes is not to realise that people have inheritance, they're polymorphic, and actually if we design systems using both people and software as objects, we can get a lot further. Yeah, and again, that's something which is missed out because people don't see the importance of the two working together. The other concept is coherence. That's a picture I took on the Ridgeway recently. It was early morning, there was mist. I went for the views and fog stayed down until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so all I could take was pictures of spiders' webs. But they're quite beautiful. All right? Now the point is, you know that's a spider's web, even though it's not fully formed. Yeah, that's the whole point about coherence, is you don't know it's absolutely right, but you know it's kind of like there or it's going in the right direction. Now the key thing is that allows us to say that some concepts are incoherent. So for example, we know that evolutionary theory is not right. There's lots of things which are wrong in it, but it's coherent, it's going in the right direction. On the other hand, creationism is incoherent. Yeah, I love that cartoon. It has guns and everything in it, so it's satisfying. Fundamentally, what we're now starting to move to in both strategic experimentation and software development experimentation is not saying, okay, we can't know exactly, so we'll do whatever we think. But we say which ideas or hypotheses are coherent enough to justify investment, and which are incoherent enough we should stop them. And if you don't know it, there's a whole mathematics behind coherence, to which we're a major contributor. If you've got large human sensor networks with continuous capture of quantitative data, you can produce objective measures of coherence, which allow you to justify radical experiments for senior managers. Yeah? So coherence is a very important concept as we move forward. Which leads me logically on to complexity theory. And traditionally it's posed as these two alternatives. It's either ordered or it's chaos. More dictatorships have been established in countries and organizations on the basis this is the only option than anything else. Now the reality is there are three types of system, and people often confuse chaos with complexity. They also make the mistake of privileging one over the other. And you see this a lot in the Agile community. My method is complex, yours is ordered. Yeah? Now that's actually nonsense, because any good method is actually about making complex things ordered. It's a transitionary method. And then you get the nutters who say, well, actually, I'm into chaos. You complexity guys, you're way behind the line. All right? I'm into chaos. I'm a magician. This is nonsense. All right? The reality is these are systems. They all have value. They all coexist. Yeah? We need to work out to manage differently. The key message on complexity is you absorb it, you don't try and eliminate it. And my argument is most Scrum techniques and most Lean techniques attempt to eliminate complexity over short cycles. They don't absorb it, which doesn't mean they're wrong. They're right for what they do, but we need something else as well. So this is a both-and argument, not an either-or argument, to make that clear. And I don't believe in universal approaches. I think that's the other big mistake people are making. For the last 3 or 4 decades, we've been plagued with people with the solution to the problem of life, the universe, and everything. And if they were literate, they know it's 42, so they can move on anyway. Yeah, but fundamentally, one approach isn't going to hit all different types of systems. This is called multi-ontology sense-making. Yeah, so this is kind of like, anybody knows about Weick and Dervin, they were mentioned yesterday as well. Kind of like this is a level of sense-making on, it's Klein, myself, and others, which fundamentally says different types of system require different ways of making sense. So there isn't one approach to sense-making. Sense-making in an ordered system is different from a complex system, is different from a chaotic system. So it's of critical importance to understand what type of system you're in before you take action, because the action will be different. Yeah? Now the definition I use for this is important. So basically I'm going to define a system as any network with coherence. You know the coherence word now. It means it can be messy. It doesn't have to be tidy. Oh, and just a warning on the autism argument, remember? If you don't know it, the 2 departments with the highest degree of partial autism in any university are economics and computer science. Right? So this desire to have things neat and tidy and structured, we need to fight against, because it doesn't often work like that. So an agent is anything which acts within the system. It's important to realize in human systems, myths have higher agency than people. So belief systems actually have higher agency than individuals in most systems. That's just the nature of human beings, the fact we're narrative-based intelligences. That allows me to define 3 types of system. An ordered one is one in which the system constrains all agent behavior so that it's fully predictable. Nothing wrong with that. In fact, one of the unique things about human beings is we've learned how to make systems ordered. And it's actually a very good idea. If I'm in an operating theatre, I'd rather like them to have an ordered, structured, repeatable procedure which ensures that all instruments and all cotton swabs are taken out of my body before they sew me up. I mean, it seems to me that's a good idea, and spontaneous self-organisation or self-organising, that's kind of like a bad idea under those circumstances from a user point of view. The same is true of a lot of security requirements and everything else. Yeah? Now, of course, we can over-constrain a system in a way that we shouldn't. The NHS is a good example of this. I've now kind of like, they're still using IE6 for Christ's sake. I was on a conversation with some people yesterday and said, look, Google don't support anything below IE9 anymore. We're not going to support it because it costs too much. And why don't you download Firefox and Chrome? Oh, IT won't let us. Yeah, well, that's an example of getting it completely wrong, of IT becoming effectively a gatekeeper and preventing progress. Yeah, but either way, side tirade on that, because it's pissing me off at the moment. Right? So basically, system constrains agents. All right, now again, if you over-constrain it, it will break catastrophically. Work we did in IBM showed that the level of perceived bureaucracy is directly related to the density of informal networks. So the more an organization becomes bureaucratic, the more people find ways to make the system work despite itself, which disguises failure. So when failure comes, failure is catastrophic. Yeah, so order has huge power, but not if you apply it inappropriately. Then we got chaos. Now there are various definitions of chaos. The one I use is the random one, which basically says there are no constraints. Now actually it's very valuable because that's where wisdom of crowds works. Because each of the agents is independent of each of the other ones and they don't know what each other are doing, it's a chaotic system. So mathematics works in a different way. Right? It's actually very difficult to make something chaotic. This is the other mistake people make. They use chaos as a bucket where lots of things will exist. Chaos is a transitionary state. As Kaufman said, order comes for free. The minute agents exist, they start to interact, constraints emerge. Actually, it's very, very difficult to create a chaotic system. It's very valuable if you can, and you can only do it within boundaries anyway. It's rather like antimatter for the Star Trek generation. It has to be contained, all right? It's explosive if it comes into contact. So I did my maths homework to the first generation, so that's the way it works. And then finally we get a complex adaptive system. This is one where constraint and agents, effectively system and agents, co-evolve. So the constraints are constantly modified by the agents as they interact with it, but the constraints actually apply to the agents as well. And as Denning, I think somebody quoted Denning on this, which is if you don't have constraints, you ain't got a system. It's fundamental. Actually, if you don't have constraints, the constraints will have gone informal. You won't know what they are, so you can't manage them. And there's nothing wrong with management. We don't make progress without management. Those of you who don't know it, the origin of the word manage in English comes from the Italian menagerie, the ability to ride a horse. All right, so think about management like that, and you can start to see its value. You can't send the horse an email with instructions about what it was going to do next month, all right? You have to kind of like co-evolve with it. Okay, so in a complex adaptive system, you've got this co-evolutionary nature. Now, there are various ways of explaining this. How many people have heard the children's party story? Okay, I'll do it, because it's very... Okay, so... Well, yeah, so most people like to hear it more than once, right? Okay, so remember I said ontology leads to epistemology? No, I didn't, but I'm saying it now, all right? Because I'm trying to educate the world to become philosophers, all right? My degree is philosophy and physics, all right? So I'm trying to get people there. Basically, the nature of the system determines the nature of the way we know things and the way we act. So let's take the children's party as an example. If you assume the children's party is a chaotic system, then that means the children's behavior will be random. So they'll probably discover drugs and alcohol and go on a personal experience of self-discovery. Your house may burn down in the process, but all property is theft and it was socially constructed in the first place, so why are you worried about it? I don't recommend this. I've got friends in California who've tried it, never more than once. The recovery cost is very high. The ordered systems approach, on the other hand, you'd be more familiar with. Under this, it's of critical importance to agree clearly articulated learning objectives for the party in advance of the party itself. The learning objectives should be aligned with the mission statement for education in the society to which you belong, and should be printed off on motivational posters with pictures of eagles soaring over valleys and water dropping into ponds, and placed around the room where you're going to hold the party. You then produce a project plan for the party. The project plan should have clear milestones throughout the party against which you can measure progress against ideal party outcome. And the senior adult should start the party with a motivational videotape. You don't want the children wasting time in play which isn't aligned with the learning objectives. And then they should use PowerPoint to demonstrate their personal commitment to the party and to show the children how their allowances are linked to the achievement of the milestone targets. Following the highly successful completion of the party, you conduct the after-action review, update your best practice database on party management, and mandate future process improvements. If for any remote reason at the end of this the children aren't happy, you hire an appreciative inquiry practitioner who will get them to tell happy clappy stories so they have happy mental models and suitably indoctrinated to like whatever you put in front of them next time. Everybody reasonably familiar with this approach to party management? The complex systems approach, on the other hand, is very different. We start off by drawing a line in the sand known as a boundary, and we look the children in the eye and we say, cross that, you little bastards, and you die. And one of the things we learn pretty fast as adults is the value of flexible, negotiable boundaries, because rigid boundaries have a habit of becoming brittle and breaking catastrophically. Yeah? We then introduce catalytic probes, and I'm deliberately using specialist language here, because if you don't change people's language, you don't change the way they think. We then introduce catalytic probes, a football, a videotape, a barbecue, a computer game, in the hope that a pattern of play will form. If it's a beneficial one, or negative one, they're all called attractors. If it's beneficial, we amplify it. If it's negative, we dampen it. So we manage the emergence of beneficial coherence within attractors, within boundaries. And that's actually how we should be managing early stage software development. Yeah? It's actually not a linear design process. Everybody doesn't know the famous case of the American Marines who were sent to manage a children's playground in New York and were told to plan for it, so they planned for it. And it was a total bloody disaster. And a couple of 23-year-old primary school teachers came in and managed self-organizing communities. But boy, did they create boundaries. Yeah? So you manage the boundaries, you manage the probes, you manage the amplification or dampening. And if you notice, it's multiple parallel experimentation in the unknowable and imaginable. It's not a linear process done faster. Yeah, complexity is a very different way of thinking in that sense. Now with that also comes the concept of distributed cognition. So some of you anybody driven around this? 12 miles north of where I now live? Yeah? We try not to talk about Swindon in the Kennet Valley. We try and pretend it doesn't exist, all right? This is their major tourist attraction, which tells you everything you need to know about Swindon. Right? You can actually get T-shirts about I drove the magic roundabout, all right? That's what it looks like from on high. Now, you may not know this, but it has the lowest number of accidents per flow of traffic of any road junction in Europe. Yeah? And it actually never ever clogs up, despite the fact it's got Intel's headquarters, 3 building site headquarters, a football ground, and believe it or not, some people do go and watch Swindon. They've got a big car park, it's got the regional hospital and two basically shopping malls. That never ever jams up, because actually the boundaries, this is a civilized country, so you have to drive on the left. Yeah? If it was Italy, it wouldn't matter what side you drove on. So I've just come back from driving around Tuscany in a Fiat van, all right, with coordinated infolding of wing mirrors to get through medieval streets. All right, so Italy is a special case, all right. Drivers there follow flocking behaviour. It's actually been studied, all right. Fly to the centre of the flock, match speed, avoid collision. That's how Italian drivers drive, all right. Once you've got that, it's easy to survive, all right. It's a flocking mode. The point about this is you make your decision as you come in which way you go. Therefore, the system can accommodate very quickly. It's partially constrained, but the drivers have choices. Yeah? Centralized cognition, or the IT department of the NHS, looks like that. It's an attempt to control everything based on planning, and engineers have a proclivity to this. And actually that produces, as anybody knows, with traffic lights you get clustering, you get queuing theory comes in, all those sort of cool things. Yeah? So it's not that we don't have constraints, because we need some. Even in the Dutch cities where they've removed all road markings, they still got the boundaries of the roads. And what's interesting is where you remove road markings, and the same with this, people and drivers pay more attention. Because when they come into a junction, you want them paying attention, you don't want them looking at the lights. Right? So this is this anticipatory awareness, alerting people to a heightened state of perception when they need to get there. Okay, some characteristics of a complex adaptive system. I'm just going to put these up quickly for summary. They're highly sensitive to small changes. You actually don't get repeatability. Another way of thinking about this, anybody heard the phrase drivers? I heard it quite a few speeches yesterday. People are always looking for drivers. That's an ordered way of thinking. So imagine if you can, you've got a table, around the table there are electromagnets. Some of them you control, some are controlled by people you know, some you've got no idea whether they're controlled or not, but they're changing strength and polarity. In the middle of the table, and for the pedants amongst you, it has a very high coefficient of resistance. There are iron ball bearings. If all of the electromagnets keep the same strength and the same polarity, the iron ball bearings will form a stable pattern. If I change one of the magnets, the iron ball bearings will change in a predictable way, and the same change will produce the same change will produce the same change in the ball bearings. That, in traditional systems dynamics, is called a driver. And people are always trying, what are the drivers? If we change this, what result will it have? The trouble is, if it's a complex system, all of the magnets are changing all the time. So you change this magnet this time, you change it exactly the same way next time, but a magnet on the other side reverse polarity, so you get a completely different effect. And in a complex system, those are called modulators. So moving from thinking about drivers to modulators also means moving from thinking about primitive causality to recognizing that you don't know what's going to happen until it happens, and you have to respond. Right? So that switch from drivers to modulators is key, and it links in with that thing. Very small changes produces radically different results. There's no repeatability in a complex adaptive system, therefore recipes by default fail. If you understand the theory, you can cope with uncertainty. If you can only follow a recipe, you can't. Yeah, and that does mean understanding it, not just having found a model and put it in chapter 3 of your book. Okay, hindsight doesn't lead to foresight. Yeah? Because the past will not repeat, you can learn from the past. It gives you models you can use in the future, but you shouldn't you can do in the foresight. And the other problem we got on linked with this is that actually simulation doesn't actually produce prediction. Too many people are into this, kind of like if I run a simulation, okay, you can learn from it, but it doesn't produce a predictive model. I can simulate the way that birds will fly around in the sky, but I can't predict whether they'll go to the left or the right of the mountain the next time they hit it, and which way they go is actually very important. Yeah, so we've got to be careful on those things. Proximity counts. Anybody got teenage children? Okay, I'll give you a present on this. I learnt this one from the CIA. Sorry. Yeah, I was a Catholic Marxist in the 70s. It's interesting who we all ended up working with later, all right? Well, to be strictly accurate, I was a Catholic Marxist-Leninist, all right? But we won't go back there for the moment, all right? But fundamentally, one thing you can do when they come back at 3 o'clock in the morning, your first reaction is to hug them because they're alive. And your second reaction is to kill the little bastards because you've been up for 5 hours in a state of panic. Everybody know that moment? And they tell you this wonderful story involving mobile phone reception, having to look after a friend, and it's all terribly plausible. Get them to tell the story backwards. Human beings can't lie backwards consistently without major inconsistencies creeping into the story. We can all lie forwards, but we can't lie backwards. Right? So I gift you that because I don't believe in reincarnation, and every adult needs to know this one. It's also a fundamental issue on lessons learned. For example, we have techniques called future backwards, in which people look at projects by going backwards through multiple threads, not by going forwards, because that increases the amount of things you discover by a measurable percentage. Yet going backwards increases the cognitive load on the brain, so it thinks of more possibilities. Going forwards is just too easy. So again, that's the theory-informed practice. We know why that works in cognitive science terms. We apply it in theory, we allow the two to co-involve, we get something out of it. I've talked about that one. Keep your options open. Kind of like partly in deference to what Chris was talking about yesterday. But I've got to educate him a bit next Tuesday. So as I say, it's a cheap ticket to come and watch, all right? But fundamentally, what we're doing here is avoiding premature convergence. This is one of the retrospective coherence and premature convergence are the two dangers of managing a complex system. Understanding the future based on the past and rushing too quickly to a solution. The more you hold things open, the more likely you are to find out what's going on. So that links in with other stuff. And then that phrase I talked about earlier, praxis makes perfect. Okay, so 3 basic rules of a CAS. I'm not sure, sorry. That's a picture of me. That's not meant to be there. That was another picture dropped in on it. So the Mac and the thing haven't synchronized. So I'll get that right. That was me in Bogota when I weighed a lot more than I weigh now. So actually I'm quite pleased looking at that. Would have been before and after later. 3 basic principles. Finely grained objects, distributed cognition, disintermediation. If you can just drive those into your head, you'll get there. Now, you've all talked about these last day. So finely grained objects means you've got to have the right level of granularity. Small pieces of code, small organizational units. Units of 5 or 15 work very differently than units of 150 or more. So individuals don't work well, groups of 5 or 15 do work well. One line of software code, forget it. A properly formatted and documented object, good. So great, the granularity is key. And we can get coarser and coarser grained as we get more and more down the life cycle, but early stage life cycle we need to be open. And that's actually incidentally why I don't buy one of the Agile. Some people in Agile argue you should let people just write quickly and to hell with reuse. I'm old enough to know that nobody ever goes back and gets things consolidated. I think there's a fundamental rule, you write once regardless, because actually downstream the cost improves. I think actually it's just an excuse for sloppy coding. And I think the same applies to people who don't use styles in word processing documents. I think they should be taken out and garroted in public for the sake of everybody else who has to integrate their material into proposals at 2 o'clock in the morning, right? And it's those basic things. If you get the modularity right, which includes defining the interfaces and the structure, everything becomes easy, and there's theory behind to back up that. Yeah? Distributed cognition, that's actually need multiple sensor networks looking at something, not 1 or 2. It also means, by the way, that workshops, which are a fetishist device in the Agile community, are a bad idea. The same with open space. Open space is great for consensus, it's poor for dissent. The law of 2 feet means people can avoid listening to things they need to listen to. Now, it's nice and comfortable, it's safe, it doesn't upset anybody, everybody can have a good time. The reality is conflict increases scanning by over 40% against consensus. Klein and I proved that in multiple experiments in Singapore. Ritualized conflict increases scanning by over 40%, whereas consensus reduces the amount scanned over even ordinary processes. And that's because of the way the human brain pays attention to things. And disintermediation, that's removing the interpretive layers between source data and the person who needs to make decisions. So I'll talk about this briefly at the end. Our work on micronarrative means a developer should not be looking at a spec designed by an analyst or by a user executive at the start of a sprint, They should be looking at the micro-narratives gathered from users over the previous 6 months about their frustrations and needs. You need to make sure it's disintermediated. You remove the mediating layers. And that doesn't matter whether you're talking about corporate strategy or program development, it's the same principle. The more interpretive layers, the more summarization, the more aggregation, the more actually you destroy the reality of what you need to deal with. Yeah, basic principle. The other thing about models, and this is another key concept, scaffolding, and I'm deliberately using bamboo scaffolding in here. If anybody's been to Hong Kong or Singapore, they just throw up bamboo poles tied together on, it's an amazing process, and they survive hurricanes and everything else. The whole point about scaffolding is that it provides support, but then the support gets taken away when the structure is there. And that's how we need to think about models. Models are designed to create support, to create something which then becomes self-sustaining, not to create a dependency on the consultant who introduced it. Yeah? So thinking about scaffolding in that way, sorry, I flicked the thing, come back in a second. Well, I hope it will come back. Is it coming back? It was working perfectly a minute ago, as they say. Okay, well, I'll hope it will come up in a second. Yeah, okay. Yeah. You obviously use Microsoft, not Apple. Okay. You know this VGA lead that goes between the Apple thing and that? Everybody thinks it's a connection device. It isn't. It's a decontamination unit. Yeah. That VGA cable has touched Windows, all right? Okay. Secondly, we need to understand that models are always restricted in human systems. As Murray Gell-Mann famously said, the only valid model of a human system is the system itself. So models are only ever a partial representation, and we shouldn't regard them as complete. And the other fundamental principle for any framework is if you can't draw it on the back of a table napkin from memory, it has little or no utility. Yeah? Because actually it can't be used for sense making. So the minute a model can't be remembered, and if it's got more than about 5 elements in it, nobody can remember it anyway, because the human short-term memory is restricted to 7 plus or minus 2. Yeah, so 5 is a good rule of thumb. If people can't literally draw it very quickly and talk about it, it has no utility. That's the napkin test. Now, say Cynefin does that, and so I'm going to briefly, it's more than well documented, so I'm just putting it up. It basically said order divides into 2, simple and complicated. In simple order, the relationship between cause and effect is self-evident, so I can apply best practice, I can do what I've always done before. In complicated order, there is a relationship between cause and effect. It will repeat, there is a right answer, but it requires analysis or investigation to find out what it is. Those are common areas, and there is a big difference between good practice and best practice. Good practice has variance in it. Best practice is one way of doing things. Yeah? Complex, we've talked about that. You probe, sense, respond. You do safe-to-fail experiments. You create some boundaries. You throw in probes. You see what happens. As good things happen, you amplify them. As bad things happen, you dampen them. Very different approach. And of course, chaos is a temporary state. If you fall into it accidentally, you want to get out of there. To go into it deliberately is a managed process. Nothing ever lives in chaos as a natural state. Yeah, not in the way I've defined it. The thing everybody forgets about Cynefin is the middle bit, which is disorder, which is the state of not knowing which of the domains you're in, which is where we are most of the time. And of course, at the bottom, you've got this collapse from complacency. That's the catastrophic shift. Now, the key thing on Cynefin, and I'm doing this quickly because it's been discussed endlessly, everybody forgets is actually about that. It's not about putting things into a box and say we do things here. That's the starting point. It's about actually managing that dynamic shift. So you want to increase, as an idea emerges, you increase the constraint, so it becomes more structured, it becomes more complicated, so now I can exploit it. As I then need to relax the constraint, so new possibilities become emergent, so I want to be constantly relaxing, increasing constraints to get that cycle between the complex and the complicated domains. Properly done, Scrum actually is a complex, complicated transitionary device. But it's very close to the boundary of complicated. Yeah? And I'll finish off with a subdomain model on this. Occasionally I need to radically reset a system. And that's actually where I use chaos to completely disrupt. You shouldn't do that unless the system is so entrained it requires a major intervention, but sometimes you have to do that. Yeah? Break the thing and start again. Something, for example, Microsoft have never really done with Windows, and you can see the consequences right up to organizational structures. Sometimes something has become so entrained, so unable to move, you have to break it. But you need to break it in a controlled way so you can pull it out fast. That's what we call a shallow dive into chaos, not a deep dive into chaos, so it's a planned process. And of course, some things go into simple, but they go there to die. Right? They may take 20 years and actually have huge value while they die, but actually they're at the final entropy stage now, they're not going to be changed. Yeah, so standard operating procedures can go there. Once they're out of utility, you create a new one. Yeah? Now, for those who want some backup on this, the original Harvard article has won 2 awards. It was the best practitioner paper in the Academy of Management the year it was published. I think it's the only Harvard article which has won an Academy of Management award. It's the only Harvard article where the editor devoted the entire editorial to one article, and that's worth downloading as well. That was considered important. And it's one of the 20 most published papers in management science, most referenced papers in management science now. And Gartner have recently come out with a nice little statement which basically says, I said, why did you restrict it to IT operations? And they said that was the report we were commissioned to write. Right? And the reason that they're saying that, it's worth getting the report, I can't publish the whole thing, is fundamentally IT departments, both operationally and development terms, need to understand this complex, complicated distinction, because actually you won't survive unless you take a complex, pro-evolutionary attitude with your users. Okay, so let's look at the complex domain in a bit more detail, and I'll finish off with this. That's kind of like the normal reaction, all right? I wish he'd drawn this with let's hold a stand up, all right, or something like that. And you also have to remember I'm Welsh, so the dragons are the good guys and the guys with the big swords are the bad guys, all right? Just to be clear on that. And I love coming to Edinburgh every 2 years for the annual, never mind, we won't go. Okay, so if we look at the complex domain, this is one of a series of subdomain models which have been developing, and several people in the audience helped contribute to these over the years, so I'll acknowledge them on the blog sooner or later. This actually looks at the degree of acceptance against the type of evidence available. Right, so this is a subdomain, it's a domain model. You can see the line going diagonally is called the line of coherence. So the bottom left goes into chaos, the top right goes into complicated. I'm trying with these this is an alternative entry into the way of thinking, but it's also, don't just treat it as a set of 4 buckets. All right, realize it's a dynamic. So what normally happens is you get people who know they're right, but nobody else buys into it. All right, it's only a small group of people who know they're right. They think the solution to knowing that they're right and other people not accepting is to tell everybody else why they're right more vigorously. And when that doesn't wrong, they start to tell everybody else why they're wrong. And then they wonder why they get dragged out into the village square, tied to a large wooden pole. People appear with faggots and burning torches and they get burnt alive, all right? Metaphorically these days, but it has changed. There are 2 approaches with heretics. It's green because it's good. You're always going to need those. But one of the ways you approach that is, 1, coaching. And it's actually where coaching really comes into its own, the ability to translate the ideas of people who are thinking differently into orthodoxy. It's one of the roles we're now advocating for people who are retiring or close to retirement, because they've got the networks, they're not playing the power politics anymore, they know how to interpret things, and actually moving them into this in a part-time role before and after retirement is hugely valuable. The other strategy is a skunk works. If you really think it's valuable as a leader, hide it somewhere so nobody can touch it. This is, by the way, where the lean concept of transparency goes wrong. Transparency, fully implemented, is the enemy of innovation because nobody can hide, so nobody takes risks. Yeah? If you don't trust your leaders to hide some stuff within their budgetary authority, they shouldn't be in a leadership position. Yeah? Transparency is actually dangerous because nobody takes risk. So the ability to do skunk works is actually quite important. On the other hand, if we're up here, and the evidence here, inductive, I mean case-based, right? So kind of like, we've got cases, we've got some evidence for it, but a case-based approach is never fully true because you might find the case which refutes it. So if everybody now believes this, this is synchrony, everybody is in step, it's actually dangerous. You need to put it back down onto the diagonal. Yeah, until you've actually got absolute proof, you don't move it across there. And of course, the real danger is here. This is where everybody believes in something, but there's no evidence for it. Yeah? And you can see lots of examples in technology. And remember the DEC Alpha? Yeah, great little machine got wiped out by the IBM PC. Yeah, I made my reputation by choosing Windows over OS2 with great reluctance. I almost got fired for it from the board because they said OS2 will win because it's IBM backed. But you could see the market had adopted Windows, and even though it was a very poor technology, it was going to win. Yeah? And this is extensive, right? And groupthink is really dangerous. Everybody's in step, but there's no evidence. Right? So there, you either challenge it or you break it, review the evidence. What you're really trying to do is to move across this diagonal. So the center stage is where you get into serious investment, and that includes Scrum. A Scrum team is a serious investment. Right? And that's actually where we got enough buy-in. So it's orthodoxy, people buy into it, it's got acceptance. Users say they want this thing, so they're prepared to put in money. And we got evidence in the base of analysis, case-based approaches, workshops which show we should do it. Sound familiar? Right, Scrum's in the middle. That's where it starts. Yeah? And the whole Scrum process is to shift it up that line. By multiple linear iterations, we increase the evidence base, we get it right, we move it around several times, and then we can move it over into the complicated domain for full exploitation, which is release cycles, scaling, all those sort of good things. Yeah? What's missing is this bit. The bit where actually you've got small groups of people working largely off gut feel. This is also where you've got users who don't really know what they want. Yeah, and the old adage on this is that users don't know what they want until they get it, and then they want something different. Yeah? And the other one is anybody who's ever written a requirements documentation, with entity models and stuff like that in it, designed by the IT industry so users would sign something they didn't understand but we could hold them accountable for later. Right? I mean, that's the way the system works, all right? Let's be honest about it. Yeah? The reality is this is the unexplored and interesting space, and it requires two separate methods which I'll mention, but I can't go into detail on. The first is safe-to-fail experimentation. We have a whole control process for that. It actually says what you don't do. If anybody, I gave a keynote in Zurich a couple of weeks ago where I went into the rest of this in more detail, so you can always pick that up from the website and listen to it. But fundamentally, in safe-to-fail experiments, you have a portfolio of parallel experiments run by different people, and the experiments are designed to contradict each other. Yeah? You don't run one thing in parallel and see if it works. You run contradictory things in parallel. Yeah? You need to make sure that one of the experiments is oblique. It's trying to solve a different problem. Now you're getting acceptation to work for you in a very different way. Okay? And also you need to make sure that some of the experiments use naive expertise. I put anthropologists into a hotel chain worldwide to study it as anthropologists. And I didn't use anthropologists who'd ever worked in industry. I took PhD students directly from a project in Papua New Guinea. The paper they wrote on mating rituals in the kitchen was fascinating. But the work they did on ritual confrontation and authority structures in reception in the restaurant actually allowed us to change the management structure. They had a completely naive perspective, but deep expertise. I've used biology professors to look at engineering problems. Yeah, so this is a portfolio-based approach. And managers get this. If I don't know about it, I have a portfolio, I have at least 7 experiments, they're all safe to fail. The signs of failure, the signs of success are identified, the strategy to amplify or dampen is identified. In the portfolio, this is the oblique one, this is the naive one. Okay, tick in the box, go do it. Yeah? Because actually that's managing this level of uncertainty. The other big thing in the course of this is mass micro-narrative. And this is the work where we're capturing huge volumes of data in real time. So, again, if anybody wants to play with this, we actually used the software recently at Agile Australia. So if you download SenseMaker from the App Store, you can put in a project code which is Agile AU2013. That's capital A, G-I-L-E, capital AU 2013, and play with it. That was done for conference assessment. But the concept behind our approach to micro-narrative is people tell stories continuously throughout their experience. I was frustrated by this. Why can't the system do that? Is there anything which would help me do this job? But not in workshops, not in analysts, continuously on a real-time basis. Then clusters of those narratives, because they're self-interpreted into a quantitative framework, you'll see that if you play it, then become the new user requirement documentation. A coherent, measurable cluster then gets a safe-to-fail experiment and an object developed. Yeah? So you move into that disintermediation principle, finely grained objects, all those sort of things. And the other good thing is you can then say, well, if I develop this, it will change the stories. Right, well, you're continuing to capture the story. You've got a measure of whether you've changed the story, so you've got a measure of coherence as to whether you move into full production. That's also the same system, by the way, we use for wisdom of crowds. So if I've got a selection of the population continuously telling stories, which is less burden than being interviewed, I can then push questions out to them in real time, get the answers back in a quantified way, and I can actually ask questions. And that's what we call building human networks for ordinary purpose that can be activated in the event of extraordinary need. Okay? So there are a whole new body and tools and techniques around this, but they're based on different principles. Systems thinking focuses on future state and closing the gap. That's what it's always done. Whether it's Peter Senge with learning organization or any of the various agile or manufacturing methods. Complexity says you can't know the future, so focus on describing the present and making changes in the present so you can evolve forwards to a sustainable and resilient future that you couldn't actually have anticipated. And that is the real danger. The desire for consensus destroys innovation. Allowing for dissent and differences under conditions of uncertainty is key, not just to producing a better result, but actually to survival. So the plea here is for theory-informed practice. Theory on its own is a waste of time. Practice on its own is a waste of time. Just saying, just go and do things because they worked, or if it works, it's okay, is a sign of a lazy brain. If you don't understand why, you can't scale it. Thank you very much for your time.
You talked about conflict increasing scanning and consensus decreasing scanning. What did you mean by that?
If you actually, well, let me give you an example. We developed a technique called ritual descent, which I think was mentioned yesterday. Right? So in ritual descent, so if you've got an idea, you get 5 teams to develop ideas on the same subject in parallel. Then each team sends a person to the next table to present the idea. And they got 4 minutes. That's an attention span limit. Yeah, at the end of the 4 minutes, they put on a mask. Yeah, so they're depersonalized. And the group, by the way, are not allowed to ask questions or gain clarification. They just listen. The person then puts on a mask or turns their chair around. And the group are told to savage the idea. Unprincipled, unremitting, unreasonable, unfair. How could this go wrong? And all they can do is listen and take notes. Then they go back to the group and they say, you know what happened to me? And it doesn't mean they were right, but we've got to take account of this. And the group, of course, have been beating somebody else up, so they got some ideas too. So before an idea even goes into production, it goes through 4 rounds of ritual descent. Now, in the experiments Gary Klein and I did, we actually measured what things people took into account before and after. In a consensus-based approach, the amount of things they take account of reduces because of the desire for consensus. In ritual descent, the amount of things they take account of increases dramatically. All right? The bit is ritualized, so it's depersonalized. The same is true of micronarrative capture. If you have a couple of analysts capturing material, they form an opinion, they talk with each other, by the time they write the document, they've lost so much that you can get things badly wrong. If, on the other hand, you've got 10,000 micronarratives, yeah, and you've got statistical patterns in that, the actual developer can look directly at the pattern in the micronarratives and say, hang on a minute, but you know what it's like? When I was developing code, halfway through developing it, you have a bright idea. You've now got a way of actually using that bright idea, but you can see how it matches against stories and you can justify yourself later. Yeah, that help?
Thanks, Dave. Thank you very much.